The stage was set and the air buzzed with anticipation. Clarence Leavitt, a name that had become synonymous with hard-hitting journalism, adjusted his tie in the green room of a bustling studio in Rome. Outside, the streets were alive with chatter about the church's latest stance on climate change, a topic that had been dominating headlines for weeks. But inside the studio, something else was brewing. Whispers about Pope Robert Prevost, the newly elected pontiff, were spreading like wildfire. Leavitt wasn't one to let things slide. Known for his razor-sharp questions and uncanny ability to dig deep into matters others preferred to leave untouched, he had earned both admiration and enemies over the years. Tonight, though, he wasn't just here to talk about the environment. He had done his homework, hours upon hours of research, and he knew there was more to this story than met the eye. Pope Robert Prevost wasn't your typical pope. Before ascending
to the papacy, he was an archbishop from Chicago, someone who had spent most of his career flying under the radar. What made him stand out? Well, not much, or so it seemed. On paper, Prevost was a quiet man, respected but not particularly influential. In fact, his rise to prominence was as unexpected as it was controversial. Records showed he'd been passed over twice for higher positions back in the U.S., reportedly because of doctrinal concerns. Yet here he was, leading one of the oldest and most powerful institutions in the world. Cardinal Alessandro Bianchi, the Vatican Secretary of State, sat across from Leavitt in the studio. A seasoned diplomat, Bianchi exuded calmness, but Leavitt could sense the tension beneath the surface. The cardinal had agreed to the interview under the impression it would focus solely on the church's environmental initiatives. Little did he know what Leavitt had planned. As the cameras rolled and the red light blinked on, Leavitt wasted no time getting to the heart of the matter. After a brief exchange about climate change, he leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking onto Bianchi's. "Your Eminence," he began, his voice steady but laced with curiosity. "Let's talk about Pope Robert." His appointment caught many by surprise. Some might even call it unconventional. Can you shed some light on how someone with such a low profile suddenly became the leader of the Catholic Church? The question hung in the air, heavy and loaded. Bianchi hesitated for a moment, clearly caught off guard. He cleared his throat before responding, choosing his words carefully. "The Holy Spirit works in mysterious ways," he replied, attempting to steer the conversation toward faith rather than facts. But Leavitt wasn't about to let him off the hook that easily. "Mysterious, perhaps," Leavitt said, raising an eyebrow.
But records indicate Archbishop Prevost faced challenges earlier in his career. Challenges significant enough to keep him from advancing within the American hierarchy. And yet here we are. So my question remains, how did he gain the support needed to become Pope? Bianchi shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The studio, once filled with the hum of equipment and distant chatter, now felt eerily silent.
It was as if everyone present could feel the weight of what was unfolding. Leavitt pressed on, his tone polite but firm. "There are also rumors," he added, pausing briefly for effect, "that a meeting in Malta played a role in his nomination. Any truth to that?" At this point, the cardinal's composure began to crack. His jaw tightened and he glanced away momentarily, searching for a way to navigate the increasingly treacherous waters of the conversation. "I assure you, Mr. Leavitt," he finally said, his voice tinged with frustration, "these allegations are baseless. The conclave operates in strict confidentiality, guided only by prayer and discernment." Leavitt nodded slowly, as if considering the response, but his expression betrayed nothing. He knew better than to push too hard at this stage. The goal was to plant seeds of doubt, not to alienate his guest entirely. Still, the damage was already done. Viewers around the world watched with bated breath, their minds racing with questions. Who exactly was Pope Robert Prevost, and why did his path to the papacy seem shrouded in mystery? As the segment continued, Leavitt subtly steered the discussion back to safer topics, allowing Bianchi to regain some semblance of control. But the bombshell had been dropped, and there was no turning back. By the time the interview concluded, social media platforms were ablaze with speculation.
Hashtags like Konings Huis Pope Robert and Schreiner's Vatican Secrets began trending globally, drawing millions of views and comments. Supporters of the new pope defended his integrity, while critics demanded answers. For Leavitt, this was just the beginning. He had opened Pandora's box, and now the world was watching to see what would come pouring out. As he packed up his notes and left the studio, he couldn't help but smile. This story had all the makings of a modern-day thriller, one that would challenge the very foundations of faith, power, and trust, and he was ready to take it head-on. The interview was supposed to be routine, a polite exchange about the church's role in addressing climate change. But as Clarence Leavitt leaned forward, his piercing gaze fixed on Cardinal Alessandro Bianchi, it became clear that this was anything but ordinary. The cardinal had answered the earlier questions with practiced ease, his responses polished and diplomatic. But now the tone shifted. Leavitt wasn't here just to ask surface-level questions. He was here to dig deeper. "You mentioned the Holy Spirit guiding the conclave," Leavitt said, his voice calm but deliberate. "But let's talk specifics. Pope Robert's rise has raised eyebrows, not just among critics but even within the church itself. Some say his nomination came out of nowhere. Others suggest there might have been external influences." Bianchi stiffened slightly, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. He knew where this was going. "Mr. Leavitt," he began, his tone measured but firm. "The process of electing a pope is sacred and confidential. It's not subject to speculation or conjecture." Leavitt nodded, as if acknowledging the point, but he didn't back down. Instead, he reached for a folder on the table in front of him. Inside were documents he had spent weeks gathering, emails, financial records, and testimonies from sources close to the Vatican. He pulled out a single sheet of paper and held it up for the cameras to see. "This is an email," he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "It's from a bishop in Malta dated 3 years ago. In it, he refers to someone as Papa Roberto, a nickname reportedly used for Archbishop Prevost at the time. The email also mentions unorthodox alliances that could have influenced his standing within the church." The room seemed to freeze. Even the crew behind the cameras stopped moving, their eyes glued to the unfolding drama. Cardinal Bianchi's face turned pale, and for a moment, he looked like he might stand up and walk out. But instead, he forced himself to stay, seated, his knuckles white as he gripped the armrests of his chair. "I'm afraid I can't comment on anonymous leaks or unverified documents," he said, his voice tight. "These accusations are reckless and irresponsible." Leavitt didn't flinch. He knew the cardinal would try to dismiss the evidence, but he also knew the public wouldn't let it go so easily. "Reckless or revealing?" he countered, leaning back slightly to let the question hang in the air. "Let me read you a line from this email. His views on celibacy reform could destabilize traditionalist strongholds, but his connections overseas, they assure loyalty." "What exactly does that mean, Your Eminence?"
"Who are these connections?" The cardinal's jaw tightened. He glanced at the moderator, perhaps hoping for some intervention, but none came. This was live television, and there was no script to follow. The world was watching, and every word mattered. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Bianchi spoke. "I will not dignify these baseless claims with a response," he said, his voice rising slightly. "If you're looking for scandal, Mr. Leavitt, you won't find it here. The Catholic Church operates on principles of faith, humility, and service, not on conspiracy theories." The audience erupted. Not in the studio, of course. That remained. Eerily silent, but online. Social media platforms lit up instantly with millions of viewers weighing in on the explosive exchange. Some defended the cardinal, accusing Leavitt of sensationalism and disrespect. Others praised him for daring to ask the tough questions, calling him a hero for exposing potential corruption.
Hashtags like Turn Vatican Leaks and Turn Truth About Prevost began trending worldwide, drawing reactions from all corners of the globe. Back in the studio, Leavitt pressed on, sensing he had struck a nerve. "Cardinal, I understand your position, but the
Church has faced criticism before over secrecy and lack of transparency.
Many people feel that if there's nothing to hide, then why not address these concerns openly? Why not reassure the faithful that the process is as pure as you claim? Bianchi's frustration was evident now. He shifted uncomfortably in his
seat, his usual composure crumbling under the weight of Leavitt's relentless questioning.
"I'll say it again. These allegations are false," he snapped, "and I will not participate in spreading misinformation. If you have further questions about the church's mission and values, I'm happy to discuss them, but this line of
inquiry ends here." With that, the cardinal signaled to the moderator, indicating he wanted to end the interview early. The moderator hesitated, clearly unsure how to handle the situation, but eventually nodded. "Thank you, Your Eminence."
"For joining us today," she said quickly, trying to wrap things up. "And thank you, Mr. Leavitt, for your insightful questions." As the cameras cut away, Leavitt sat quietly, a faint smile playing on his lips. He knew he had pushed the boundaries, but he also knew the story was far from over. Outside the studio, phones buzzed incessantly as viewers shared clips of the heated exchange.
News outlets scrambled to analyze the implications while Vatican officials worked overtime to craft a response. Later that evening, the Vatican released a brief statement condemning the breach of trust caused by the leaked documents. They
dismissed the allegations as malicious lies aimed at undermining the authority of the church. But the damage was done. People weren't just asking questions anymore. They were demanding answers. For Leavitt, the fallout was immediate. His network faced pressure from both sides, calls to retract the story from conservative groups and demands for further investigation from progressive voices. Meanwhile, emails and messages poured into his inbox, some praising his courage, others
threatening his safety. Yet despite the backlash, Leavitt felt a sense of purpose. He had spent decades chasing stories that mattered, and this was bigger than anything he'd ever uncovered. As he reviewed the footage from the interview,
later that night he couldn't help but think about the ripple effect it would have. The Catholic Church was one of the oldest and most influential institutions in the world, and its leadership was now under intense scrutiny. Whether Pope Robert Prevost was a reformer, a puppet, or something else entirely remained to be seen. But one thing was certain. The truth was out there, waiting to be uncovered. And Leavitt wasn't about to stop until he found it. The fallout from the live interview was immediate and explosive. As soon as the cameras cut off, Cardinal Alessandro Bianchi stormed out of the studio without another word to Clarence Leavitt or the production team. His face was flushed, his
usually calm demeanor replaced by visible anger. Back at the Vatican, phones rang nonstop in offices that rarely dealt with such chaos. The Church's communications department scrambled to issue a formal response, but it was already too late.
Social media had taken over, dissecting every second of the interview and amplifying the tension. Clarence Leavitt, on the other hand, seemed unfazed by the storm he had unleashed. Sitting in his hotel room later that evening, he watched clips of the interview replay on news channels around the world. Analysts debated whether he had crossed a line, while others praised him for holding power accountable. Leavitt knew this wasn't just about him. It was about something much bigger. For decades, the Catholic Church had operated behind closed doors, its inner workings shrouded in mystery. Now cracks were beginning to show, and people wanted answers. But Leavitt wasn't done yet. Over the next few days, more information began to surface, information that made the initial bombshell look like child's play. A whistleblower reached out to him anonymously, sending encrypted files filled with financial records linking Pope Robert Prevost's former archdiocese in Chicago to offshore accounts tied to the Knights of Malta. These weren't small sums of money. They were significant transfers, enough to raise serious questions about where the funds came from and why they were being moved. Leavitt didn't rush to publish the details right away. He knew how delicate the situation was, and he wanted to ensure everything he shared was accurate. So, he spent hours verifying the documents, cross-referencing them with public records, and consulting experts who specialized in tracking illicit financial activity. What he uncovered painted a troubling picture. Prevost's rise might not have been as divinely inspired as the Vatican claimed. Instead, it appeared to involve influential figures within secretive Catholic orders, groups known for their conservative views and deep pockets. Meanwhile, the Vatican released another statement, this time accusing Leavitt and his network of spreading falsehoods designed to harm the reputation of the Holy See. They even hinted at legal action, threatening lawsuits if the allegations continued. But instead of silencing the conversation, the threats only fueled it further. Viewers began questioning why the church would resort to intimidation tactics if there was truly nothing to hide. Progressive Catholics saw this as proof that reform was long overdue, while traditionalists doubled down, calling Leavitt an enemy of faith. Amid all the noise, a new voice emerged, a former seminarian who had served under Pope Robert during his time as an archbishop in Chicago. This individual agreed to speak to Leavitt on the condition of anonymity, fearing retaliation. In a recorded interview conducted in a dimly lit cafe far from prying eyes, the seminarian revealed startling details. According to him, Pope Robert had once expressed controversial opinions during private meetings with clergy members. He reportedly questioned the necessity of priestly celibacy, suggesting it might be outdated in modern times. Even more surprising, he allegedly advocated for leniency when dealing with priests accused of misconduct, arguing that harsh punishments often drove them away from seeking redemption. When Leavitt aired the seminarian's testimony, the reaction was swift and polarizing. Supporters of Pope Robert saw him as a forward-thinking leader willing to challenge outdated traditions. Critics, however, viewed him as a dangerous figure undermining centuries of doctrine. The divide grew wider with each passing day, and the Catholic Church found itself caught in the middle of a battle it hadn't anticipated. Leavitt's network faced mounting pressure, not just from the Vatican but also from advertisers nervous about associating with such contentious content.
Calls poured in from both sides, some urging him to stop, others begging him to keep going. Despite the risks, Leavitt felt a responsibility to see the story through. He believed that transparency mattered, especially when it came to institutions
that wielded so much influence over millions of lives. As the days turned into weeks, the narrative shifted again. Leaked audio recordings surfaced online, purportedly featuring Pope Robert himself discussing sensitive topics during closed-door meetings. One clip in particular stood out. In it, a man identified as Pope Robert could be heard saying, "If Rome won't bend, the peripheries will break away." The phrase sent shockwaves through the church, interpreted by some as a veiled threat to decentralize power if reforms weren't implemented. The Vatican denied the authenticity of the recordings, labeling them as fabrications meant to discredit the Pope. Yet the damage was undeniable. Bishops around the globe started taking sides, some publicly defending Pope Robert, while others called for investigations into his leadership. Progressive bishops praised his willingness to address long-standing issues, while traditionalists warned that his approach risked fracturing the church beyond repair. For Leavitt, the entire saga was both exhilarating and exhausting.
He had spent years chasing stories that exposed corruption and challenged authority, but nothing compared to this. Everywhere he went, people recognized him. The man who dared to question the Pope. Strangers approached him on the street, thanking him for shining a light on the truth, while others glared at him, muttering accusations of blasphemy. It was clear that his actions had struck a nerve, forcing people to confront uncomfortable realities about an institution many held sacred. One evening, after a long day of interviews and research, Leavitt sat alone in his apartment, staring at the stack of documents spread across his desk. He thought about the ripple effects of what he had uncovered. Would this lead to meaningful change within the church, or would it deepen existing divisions? Only time would tell. But one thing was certain: the story wasn't over, not by a long shot. Leavitt leaned back in his chair, letting out a deep sigh. He knew the road ahead would be fraught with challenges, but he also knew that walking away wasn't an option. The truth was messy, complicated, and often painful, but it was worth fighting for. And as long as there were secrets hiding in the shadows, he would keep digging until they saw the light of day.
The tension surrounding Pope Robert Prevost's papacy reached a fever pitch as more revelations came to light. Clarence Leavitt, now firmly entrenched in the center of the storm, continued to dig deeper into the web of allegations and secrets. Each new piece of evidence only added fuel to the fire, sparking debates that stretched far beyond religious circles and into mainstream conversations around the world. One of the most explosive developments came when financial investigators working with Leavitt uncovered connections between offshore accounts linked to the Knights of Malta and funding streams tied directly to projects overseen by Pope Robert during his time as an archbishop in Chicago. These weren't small donations for charitable causes. They were substantial sums funneled through complex networks designed to obscure their origins. The implications were staggering. Critics argued that these funds could have been used to curry favor or secure alliances within the church hierarchy, while defenders dismissed the claims as circumstantial at best. As the story gained momentum, Leavitt decided it was time to release a follow-up report. This time he went beyond documents and anonymous tips. He tracked down individuals who had worked closely with Pope Robert in the past, people willing to speak on record about what they had witnessed. One such source was a former administrator from the Archdiocese of Chicago. This individual described
how certain decisions made under Pope Robert's leadership seemed unusual, even suspicious at the time.
For instance, large amounts of money were allocated to initiatives that benefited specific groups within the church, but lacked transparency in how they were chosen or managed. Leavitt aired these testimonies during a primetime special, presenting them alongside the financial records he had gathered. The segment opened with a simple yet powerful statement. When power operates in secrecy, questions arise. When billions are moved without clear explanations, trust erodes. And when leaders rise unexpectedly, we must ask why. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Progressive Catholics hailed Pope Robert as a reformer, a man brave enough to challenge entrenched traditions and bring much-needed change to an aging institution. They pointed to his advocacy for leniency toward clergy accused of misconduct as proof that he cared more about redemption than punishment. Traditionalists, however, saw him as a threat to everything the church stood for.
To them, his alleged ties to secretive organizations like the Knights of Malta suggested a hidden agenda aimed at dismantling core doctrines. The divide grew sharper with each passing day. Bishops across the globe began taking sides openly, some defending Pope Robert's vision for a modernized church, while others called for investigations into his leadership. In Rome, whispers of dissent echoed through the Vatican's hallowed halls. Cardinals who once supported Pope Robert now found themselves questioning whether his rise had been divinely inspired or politically orchestrated. Amid the chaos, the Vatican issued yet another statement, this time accusing Leavitt of orchestrating a smear campaign fueled by misinformation.
They demanded retractions and threatened legal action against anyone spreading what they called false narratives. But instead of silencing critics, the threats only emboldened them. Protesters gathered outside St. Peter's Square, holding
signs that read "Transparency now" and "Faith deserves truth."
Some supporters of Pope Robert joined the demonstrations, chanting slogans like "Reform is coming," while opponents held counter-protests, waving banners emblazoned with traditional prayers and symbols. For Leavitt, the pressure mounted. His
network faced backlash from both sides, conservative advertisers pulling funding and progressive voices demanding faster action. Death threats poured into his inbox daily, forcing him to hire private security and relocate temporarily. Yet despite
the risks, Leavitt remained resolute. He believed the story was too important to ignore, not just for Catholics but for anyone concerned about accountability and integrity in positions of power. In the midst of the turmoil, Pope Robert himself broke his silence. In a rare move, he granted an exclusive interview to a rival news outlet, choosing a platform known for its sympathetic coverage of the church. Dressed in simple white robes, he addressed the camera with calm authority. "Yes, I am aware of the accusations," he said, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "And yes, I understand why people have questions. But let me be clear. My commitment is to serve the faithful, not to enrich myself or any organization. If mistakes were made, they were not mine alone."
He went on to acknowledge the leaked audio recordings, admitting that the voice heard was indeed his. However, he framed the controversial quote, "If Rome won't bend, the peripheries will break away," as a call for unity rather than division. The church must evolve, he explained. It cannot remain frozen in the past while the world moves forward. Change is difficult, yes, but it is necessary if we are to fulfill our mission. The interview drew mixed reactions.
Supporters praised Pope Robert for addressing the controversy head-on, calling him courageous and visionary. Critics, however, accused him of evading direct answers and using vague language to deflect blame. Either way, the interview failed to quell the growing unrest. Instead, it reignited debates about where the line should be drawn between tradition and progress. Back in his makeshift office, Leavitt watched the interview unfold, taking notes and analyzing every word. He knew the Pope's response would dominate headlines for days, but he also sensed there was still more to uncover. As he sifted through the mountain of documents and testimonies he had collected, one thing became increasingly clear. The story of Pope Robert Prevost wasn't just about one man. It was about the soul of an institution grappling with its own identity in a rapidly changing world. Late one night, after hours of reviewing files, Leavitt paused and looked out the window.
The city below buzzed with life, oblivious to the weight of the secrets he carried. He thought about the countless lives touched by the church, the faithful seeking guidance, the disillusioned searching for hope, and the millions caught in the crossfire of this ideological battle. Whatever happened next, he realized, would shape not only the future of Catholicism, but also the broader conversation about faith, power, and accountability. With renewed determination, Leavitt picked up his pen and began drafting his next report.
The journey ahead promised to be long and fraught with challenges, but he knew one thing for certain. The truth, no matter how painful, deserved to be told. And as long as there were unanswered questions, he wouldn't stop until he found the answers. The story of Pope Robert Prevost had reached a tipping point, and Clarence Leavitt was at the heart of it all. With each new revelation, the narrative grew more complex, pulling in voices from every corner of the globe. What started as an investigation
into one man's rise to power had morphed into a broader examination of the Catholic Church itself, a centuries-old institution grappling with its identity in a modern world. Leavitt's next report was perhaps his most explosive yet.
After weeks of painstaking research, he uncovered evidence linking Pope Robert to a clandestine network of bishops who referred to themselves as modernists. These were men within the church hierarchy who believed that drastic reforms were necessary to prevent the Catholic faith from becoming irrelevant. According to leaked documents and testimonies from insiders, this group had been quietly strategizing for years, waiting for the right moment to push their agenda forward. When Pope Robert emerged as a compromise candidate during the conclave, they saw their opportunity. In a live broadcast, Leavitt laid out the details. He revealed memos exchanged between members of the group discussing how to decentralize Vatican authority and shift decision-making power to regional bishops. One document even outlined plans to loosen rules around celibacy, allowing married priests in certain areas where clergy shortages were severe. To many, these ideas sounded radical, almost heretical, but to others they represented a lifeline for a church struggling to retain followers in an increasingly secular age. Pope Robert's connection to this movement came through his alleged
involvement in secret meetings held across Europe over the past decade. Leavitt presented photos and travel records showing him attending gatherings alongside key figures in the modernist faction.
While none of this proved wrongdoing, it painted a picture of a man deeply embedded in efforts to reshape the church from within. As expected, the fallout was immediate. Traditionalists condemned the revelations, accusing Pope Robert of betraying core doctrines. Some called for his resignation, while others demanded an official investigation by the Vatican. Progressives, on the other hand, celebrated him as a visionary leader willing to challenge outdated norms. Social media erupted once again, with hashtags like "You Save the Church" and "Modern Papacy" trending globally. Debates raged online and offline, drawing in theologians, historians, and ordinary believers alike. But Leavitt wasn't done. In a bold move, he decided to confront the issue head-on by inviting representatives from both sides of the debate onto his show. The resulting panel discussion turned into a heated exchange, with participants passionately defending their views.
A bishop known for his conservative stance argued that abandoning tradition would fracture the church irreparably. "We cannot pick and choose which teachings to follow," he said firmly. "Faith is not a buffet."
A younger priest advocating for reform shot back, "And we cannot cling to practices that no longer serve the people. If we don't adapt, we risk losing entire generations." The audience watched intently as emotions ran high, reflecting the larger conflict playing out worldwide. Meanwhile, Pope Robert faced mounting pressure to address the allegations directly. In response, he issued a historic motu proprio, a papal decree initiating sweeping changes. Among them was a provision allowing married priests in select dioceses facing critical shortages.
The decision sent shockwaves through the church, hailed by some as a revolutionary step toward inclusivity and condemned by others as a betrayal of sacred vows. The Vatican braced for backlash, but instead, reactions were mixed. In regions like
South America and Africa, where the shortage of clergy was acute, bishops welcomed the change, praising Pope Robert for his pragmatism.
In Europe and North America, however, traditionalists staged protests, calling the move a slippery slope that could lead to further compromises. For Leavitt, the situation underscored just how polarized the church had become. As he reviewed footage,
from the protests and celebrations alike, he couldn't help but feel a sense of awe and trepidation. This wasn't just about doctrine or politics, it was about identity. Millions of Catholics looked to the church for guidance, comfort, and meaning. How would they navigate this period of upheaval? Determined to keep the conversation going, Leavitt published a best-selling exposé titled The Reluctant Pope. The book delved deep into Pope Robert's background, exploring how his unconventional path to the papacy mirrored the challenges facing the church today. It also examined the broader implications of his reforms, asking whether they represented salvation or destruction for Catholicism. Critics accused Leavitt of sensationalism, but readers devoured the book, eager to understand the forces shaping their faith. For many, it offered clarity in a time of confusion. Others found themselves questioning long-held beliefs, torn between loyalty to tradition and hope for renewal. Behind the scenes, Leavitt wrestled with the weight of his role in the unfolding drama. He received messages from people thanking him
for shining a light on hidden truths while others accused him of sowing discord. Death threats continued to pour in, forcing him to maintain a low profile. Yet despite the risks, he remained steadfast in his mission. "If I can give people the tools to ask hard questions and seek honest answers," he told a close colleague, "then maybe something good will come out of all this." As the months passed, the controversy showed no signs of abating. Bishops
openly clashed in synods, debating everything from celibacy to the role of women in the church. Laypeople joined the fray, organizing grassroots movements to advocate for change or resist it. Even non-Catholics weighed in, fascinated by the spectacle of an ancient institution wrestling with modernity. Through it all, Pope Robert remained a figure of contradictions. To some, he was a hero fighting against entrenched conservatism. To others, he was a dangerous innovator threatening the very foundations of the faith. And to Leavitt, he was something else entirely, a symbol of the tension between past and future, tradition and progress, unity and division. Late one night, after another grueling day of interviews and research, Leavitt sat alone in his office, staring at a blank screen. He thought about the countless lives affected by the decisions being made in Rome, the families divided, the communities fractured, the individuals searching for answers. Then he smiled faintly, knowing that stories like this didn't have neat endings. They lingered unresolved, challenging us to keep asking questions and seeking truth. With a deep breath, he typed the final sentence of his latest article. "The story isn't over. It's only just begun." The Catholic Church stood at a crossroads, its future uncertain as the world watched with bated breath. Pope Robert Prevost's bold reforms had ignited a firestorm that refused to die down. For months, the debate raged on social media, in pews and within the hallowed halls of the Vatican itself. Traditionalists dug their heels in, determined to preserve centuries of doctrine, while progressives pushed for sweeping changes they believed were long overdue. At the center of it all was Clarence Leavitt, whose relentless pursuit of truth had forced the Church into the spotlight. Leavitt's exposé, The Reluctant Pope, became required reading for anyone trying to make sense of the chaos. The book didn't just chronicle Pope Robert's rise.
It painted a vivid portrait of an institution struggling to reconcile its past with the demands of the present. Readers devoured every page, some finding solace in Leavitt's analysis, others infuriated by what they saw as bias. Either way, the conversation kept growing, fueled by the questions Leavitt dared to ask. One of the most striking aspects of the controversy was how deeply personal it felt for so many people. In small towns and bustling cities alike, families found themselves divided over the issue. A grandmother might kneel in prayer, pleading for the Church to remain steadfast in its traditions, while her grandson argued passionately for reform. Priests delivering sermons faced congregations filled with conflicting emotions, some nodding in agreement, others crossing their arms in defiance. It wasn't just about policies or doctrines anymore. It was about identity, belonging, and faith. Tensions escalated. Pope Robert made another unexpected move. He called for an extraordinary synod, a global meeting of bishops, to address the crises head-on. The announcement sent shockwaves through the Church. Such gatherings were rare, reserved only for moments of immense significance. This time, however, there was a twist. Laypeople would also be invited to participate, giving ordinary Catholics a voice in decisions that would shape their spiritual lives. The synod took place over several weeks, drawing participants from every corner of the globe. Inside the assembly hall, debates grew heated. Bishops clashed over issues like celibacy, women's roles in the Church, and how to handle clergy accused of misconduct. Outside, crowds gathered daily, holding vigils, protests, and prayer sessions. Media outlets covered the event around the clock, capturing both the drama unfolding inside and the raw emotion spilling out onto the streets. Clarence Leavitt attended as an observer, filing reports that brought the proceedings to life for his audience. He described fiery speeches, tearful confessions, and moments of surprising unity. One bishop from South America broke down in tears as he recounted losing half his congregation due to priest shortages. Another from Italy thundered against reckless innovations, warning that abandoning tradition would alienate millions. Lay representatives shared stories of feeling marginalized by the Church, but expressed cautious hope that their voices
might finally be heard. Amid the turmoil, Pope Robert remained a calming presence. Though visibly exhausted, he presided over the sessions with quiet determination. When disagreements threatened to derail discussions, he reminded everyone of their shared mission, to serve God and his people. Yet even he couldn't escape criticism. Some accused him of being too lenient, others of not going far enough. Still, no one could deny that his leadership had sparked a reckoning unlike anything the Church had seen in generations. By the end of the synod, several key decisions were announced. Married priests would be allowed in regions facing severe shortages, though the policy wouldn't apply universally. Women would take on expanded roles in parish administration, though ordination remained off the table, and a new commission was formed to review cases of clergy misconduct, promising greater transparency and accountability. While these measures fell short of satisfying either side completely, they marked a significant step forward, or backward, depending on who you asked. For
Leavitt, the outcome was bittersweet.
On one hand, he felt a sense of accomplishment. His work had helped shine a light on systemic issues that might otherwise have remained hidden. On the other hand, he knew the battle was far from over. The reforms were just the beginning of what promised to be a long and painful process of healing, or further division. In the weeks following the synod, Leavitt returned to his office, surrounded by stacks of notes, transcripts, and documents. The story had consumed him for months, yet he couldn't bring himself to walk away. There were still unanswered questions, untold stories waiting to be uncovered. As he sifted through the materials, he came across a footnote in one of the Vatican II memos he'd referenced earlier. It read, "A pope may come who will dismantle from within." The words gave him pause. Was Pope Robert that pope? Had his rise been part of a larger plan to reshape the church? Or was he simply a man caught in the middle of forces beyond his control? Leavitt didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing for certain. The Catholic Church would never be the same again. Late one evening, after finishing his final report on the synod, Leavitt sat back in his chair and exhaled deeply. The room was quiet except for the hum of his laptop and the distant sound of traffic outside. He thought about the countless hours he'd spent chasing leads, interviewing sources, and piecing together fragments of a puzzle that seemed to grow more complex with each revelation. He thought about the people he'd met along the way, the seminarian seeking redemption, the bishop clinging to tradition, the young woman yearning for inclusion. Each of them carried a piece of this story, a reflection of the hopes and fears binding humanity to faith. As he closed his laptop and turned off the lights, Leavitt allowed himself a moment of reflection. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, fraught with challenges and resistance, but he also knew that stories like this mattered, not because they provided easy answers, but because they forced us to confront hard truths. They reminded us that institutions, no matter how ancient or powerful, are made up of flawed, imperfect human beings. And sometimes those imperfections hold the key to understanding who we are and where we're headed. The next morning, as the sun rose over the city, Leavitt stepped outside, ready to face whatever came next. Somewhere in Rome, Pope Robert prepared for another day of navigating uncharted waters, and somewhere else, millions of Catholics woke up wondering what the future held for their beloved church. The story wasn't over, it was only just beginning.